It's 3:30. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session on the textiles of India. India's history with textiles is as old as time itself. Archaeological and pictographic evidences found from earliest times confirm the presence of weaving and embroidery. Accounts of Megasthenes, the Greek historian and ambassador to the court of Chandragupta Maurya in the 3rd century BCE, tells us of Indians dressed in flowered garments made of the finest muslin. So exquisite was the quality of textiles, such as calico and muslin, produced in India, and so high their demands that there was even a growing concern recorded in the 17th century Ottoman Turkey about a drain of wealth to India. So today we look at the rich textile heritage of India, its potential vis-a-vis tourism, and how experts have worked tirelessly to revive lost traditional weaves and crafts in India. I have with me today two eminent panelists to discuss and talk about the subject of textiles. Savita Radhakrishnan, raise your hand, say hi, Savita. She is an international award-winning cookbook author, playwright, columnist, and a freelance writer. Nurtures a passion for textiles and has been a textile and craft activist for over 30 years. Savita has been closely associated with textile projects and has worked with weavers and upgraded looms as projects for Crafts Council. She has given several talks and visual presentations on the various textiles of India. Savita writes food and textile columns for newspapers and a regular column for the Gym Mag of Madras Gymkhana Club, beside features for the Hindu, Madras Musings, and others. So the list goes on. I can spend another 10 minutes talking about her accomplishments, but I guess this will suffice for brevity of time. Then we have Jayanti Rajgopalan, and we call her Jaunty. There she is. She started an experiential tour company after giving up her fancy job in a corporate, a tour company called D-Tours in 2008 and based out of Hyderabad. The aim was to showcase the rich heritage and history of this country in a more interactive manner. Since then, she and her team members have led individual and small group tours to bring to the fore several lesser known crafts as well. So her experience with textiles lies in knowing and showcasing crafts and the artisans working in this area. Her tours include local textile workshops, practicing ancient weaving traditions of Himru, Mashru, and Paithani to small block printing embroidery units in the old city around Hyderabad. The longer tours also include visits to nearby villages like Pochampalli, Koyalgudam, etc., known for their ikat weaving. So we'll talk in detail about all these names. She has also done some research in the textile traditions of nearby Andhra Pradesh, namely Kalamkari and Upada. Okay, so let's get on with our presentation and discussion. So I will be presenting the textile traditions of India, and as we go along, keep asking questions from our panelists who are experts on the subject. So let's start. We are talking about the textile traditions of a land that chose charkha, the spinning wheel, as the symbol for its struggle for freedom. This is unprecedented because Mahatma Gandhi brought charkha as a freedom symbol for freedom. It symbolized not just self-reliance, but also simplicity and industriousness. Kuntal, you'll move on to the next slide, please. Kuntal is helping with the slides today as my bandwidth tends to be a bit unreliable. So the significance of khadi in India. Khadi is the fabric, hand-woven cotton fabric that came out of the spinning wheel, the charkha. So what did it symbolize? It obviously symbolized, as I said, simplicity, economic liberty, and absence of status to a sense, and a homogeneity in a nation that was trying to achieve something huge. Next. I'm going to quote Mahatma Gandhi here. If we have the Khadi spirit in us, we would surround ourselves with simplicity in every walk of life. The Khadi spirit means infinite patience. For those who know anything about the production of Khadi, know how patiently the spinners and the weavers have to toil at their trade, and even so much we have patience while we are spinning the thread of Swaraj. Swaraj is self-independence. So Khadi was not just spinning of yarn for creating fabric. It was a movement, and it was a spirit, as Gandhi liked to put it. So let's see, going forward. Next, Kuntal. So as the title says, Heritage Rediscovered. Indian hand-spun textiles, especially muslin from Bengal and other calico, as I said, took European markets by storm. And with the advent of European traders, they traded these textiles. Over a period of time, rising competition and machine-made textiles produced by British and American mills with exorbitant taxes obviously led to the decline of the traditional handicraft industry in India, the textile industry. The decline continued until Mahatma Gandhi made it a symbol of self-reliance. And post-independence, the government took on a huge role and took on this movement and established the village industries and developed Khadi and made it into a government-sponsored thing. Cooperatives played a huge role. Here I would like to invite Sabita to ask her on her views about how revival of textiles in the Khadi movement happened in post-independent India, and how the village cooperatives probably played a role. Sabita?
Okay, we're talking about Khadi, and Khadi is called freedom fabric because once Khadi came in, it was the beginning of the end of British rule in India. And I also want to say is how the British came into India was because of textiles. How they left India was because of textiles, but that's another story. So at this moment, you know that we were shackled by British rule, and our Indian weavers were treated very badly, and they used our fabric to line their coffers, and they passed off our fabric as whatever they had produced. And the malmal was so beautiful, which they call calico. It was so soft that it could pass through a ring. You know, the texture and the beauty of this was there. And things reached a pitch, and we all know about history and how Mahatma Gandhi resisted British rule, and he tried his level best to fight the British in his own peaceful way. So that's how Khadi was born. And Khadi is done, it's hand spun. There's no machine or anything used in it. And even now when they do Khadi, they get yarn from a power loom, and they weave. Most of our handlooms are done like that. But one friend of ours who was well known, Rita Chishti, she does Khadi from scratch, and the yarn is also hand spun. Well, what happened was Gandhiji said that all the women who are fashionable and belong to the upper strata of society were wearing chiffons and georgettes and pearls and imported fabric. He said, he was the one who said, be Indian, buy Indian. And what kind of fabric did we have then to choose from? So he requested that all these people should bring their mill-made Lancashire textiles to a place, and they all did out of patriotism and supporting Mahatma Gandhi. and they cremated the textiles. They made a huge fire and everybody threw their textiles in. So they didn't want to order from Britain at all, and they decided to wear handmade, fabric. And khadi was so beautiful, so simple. It had its defects. It was a little rough, but ideal for the Indian weather. And it came out in plain colors. And then, of course, the All India Handicrafts Board set up, the various cooperatives to weave khadi. But one thing that was not mentioned, which I think is very important, is that Kamla Deviji Chattopadhyay was the one who started the handloom movement to reinstate the weaver to his rightful status. She walked to villages, visited pockets where there were handlooms, and then she set up the handloom board. It was she who was responsible. And cooperatives do play a large part in the weavers' lives because they get subsidy from the government, and they were set up and orders were given, and khadi was sold in their own depots, and so to ensure it. And everyone who was patriotic those days wore khadi. Khadi was a symbol of freedom. So you'd see all the men wearing their white khadi kurtas, and they had waistcoats over them and the Gandhi cap. And things started to move. And when Britain found that the economy was hit because no one was taking any material or textiles from them, they lost out a lot. And that was the beginning of the end of the British rule in India. And that's how that was the beginning of the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabita, for that insight. We'll move on now to the next slide, Kuntal. So you see the textile map of India, how varied it is and how beautiful it looks. Each state is represented by a particular tradition and craft that exists there. So it's a huge variety of textiles that are found in India. This just shows you the varied textiles we have here. Jonty, what would be your favorite textile in India and why?
I think
one guess.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay, so in terms of wearing a fabric, I think my favorite would definitely be kalamkari, because the cotton is really soft, and the more you wash it, especially the traditional ones which are made with vegetable dyes, the more you wash it, the more faded the colors become. And it's not faded as in it doesn't, it's like faded jeans. It's almost got kind of a lovely feel, and the more you wash it, the softer the fabric becomes as well. So that would definitely be my favorite to wear. In terms of watching work being done and fabric being produced, I think my favorite would be mushroom, which has got fabric, which has got cotton on the underside of the fabric and silk on the top, so that it can show the world that you're capable and you can afford to wear silk, but actually what is touching your skin is only cotton. So it's quite an intricate process to weave fabric on an 8-petal loom. So I think those would be my two favorites.
Beautiful. And how about you, Sabita?
I want to just add something. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jonty, but it is also said that it was woven like that in a double layer, where the cotton is on the underside, because Muslims were not supposed to
have silk touching their skin.
And it's such a beautiful fabric.
Yeah.
Well, when you ask me what my favorite weave is, I'm a bit baffled because I love all the weaves. And of course, being in South India, I love Kanchipuram sarees. And I love the Kodali Katpur, but we don't have access to it in its original form. Whatever we wear are just, mass reproductions, which is not quite the same. But if you open my wardrobe, guess what you'd find most there? Ikat. I love all forms of ikat, whether it is from Orissa, whether it is from Andhra, whether it is a patola, whatever. I love ikat, and I love the labor that has gone into it.
Beautiful. I have a question on Ikat later from you, so we'll save that for later. Kuntil, can we go on? All right, so here are the segments of Indian textile industry. So as you know, cotton, it started with cotton. There's obviously silk and wool, and also there's most of them are handcrafted, and now jute and coir are also there, and people are experimenting with all kinds of new age material as well. So it's quite varied. Next. So here we talk about Pashmina from J&K. Before I talk about Pashmina, I want to give you an interesting trivia about it. Napoleon Bonaparte bought his wife, Josephine, a Pashmina shawl from India from a merchant in Egypt as a gift. Josephine was enchanted with the fine texture and weightless warmth of the shawls that she became a pioneer of making the Pashmina a fashion statement in Europe. She is supposed to have had several hundred Pashminas in her collection. So that's the story of Pashmina for you from Kashmir. So Pashmina, as commonly people understand, is cashmere in the West. And it comes from the fiber of a very special Himalayan goat called Chanthangi. And it's intricate. And the embroidery done by the Kashmiris on the karigars on the shawls is also beautiful. And there are designers who are called Naqshbands who kind of envisage what kind of design that needs to go on, and some of these designs have come from generations and generations. So mostly floral designs are there. Next. Yeah, as I spoke about that it's got a huge heritage. The art of weaving came to its zenith at the time of Mughal Emperor Akbar, who revived the old industry and improved conditions in the workshops, as they were called, karkhanas in those days. Even today the word stays, and intricate motifs were there. Then comes Punjab, and Punjab is known for its Phulkari. And Phulkari was actually a huge, like a shawl, like a chadar, a huge shawl, you can say, that was given to women on their wedding day. And it is said that the real Varida Bag, as it's called, was made when a boy was born in the family. So the grandmother started making the Phulkari right when the child was born for his daughter-in-law, for his wife. And so it took generations, maybe 2 generations, to kind of create, and several years to create a beautiful, intricate pattern that was given. So each color symbolized a certain, had a significance. So red color, for instance, most Phulkaris are red in their background, and which means fertility for the newlyweds. Next. So I already spoke about this. So we have this beautiful tour in Amritsar that kind of takes you through the narrow alleys and the bazaars of Amritsar, where you can actually see the fabric and the Phulkari and different handicrafts from Punjab in the bazaars. So we are also going to simultaneously talk about tourism, how you can weave these interesting crafts into your itineraries and into tours for travelers. Then comes the daris. So this is something fascinating. Not many people talk about the rugs and daris that Haryana produces. So Panipat actually has this heritage of weaving daris from threads, and the patterns are really intricate. The story is actually that post-partition, a whole lot of artisans and weavers were settled in this area in 1948 at the insistence of Mahatma Gandhi, and they kind of set up a whole center of dari making and rug making. And they came from the erstwhile Sindh province in Pakistan, with a city called Hyderabad. They also have something called Hyderabad there in the Sindh. And those artisans came and started making these daris here, and which became hugely popular with export houses claiming. And a lot of the export quality daris and linen and bed linen and curtains are now made in Panipat and its surrounding areas. And that's quite fascinating as well. Kuntal? Yeah, I already spoke about this. Next slide. Okay, let's come to Rajasthan. Rajasthan has this beautiful tradition of shisha. So mirror work, shisha is mirror work. And mirror work is used to be an embellishment in the Mughal courts. And later on, it came to fabrics which were worn. But it was never worn initially. Initially, it started as an ornamentation in the backdrops. So when merchant and traveler Marco Polo visited India in the 13th century, he commented that mirror work embroidery from India was more intricate and skillfully crafted than any other he had ever seen. So this again shows how traditional and ancient this art form is. Next. Kuntil?
Yeah, give me a moment, Lavin. It just got stuck.
So we decided for Kuntil to help me with the presentation because the bandwidth in my place is not that great, and now we are struggling. Anyway, so here we go. So Rajasthan is also known for block printing, and here you see a beautiful picture of a block being carved. The textiles of Rajasthan are vibrant and colorful and very similar to the textiles in Gujarat in their variety, like Bandhani, Leheria, Kota Doria, block printing, shisha work. So there's a huge range of stuff, but block printing, however, remains the most popular form, which can actually be seen in outside Jaipur in a place called Bagru and Sanganeri. So you can see how difficult it must be to carve out that block which actually gets you the print that you see on the fabric. So let's look at a tour that we do just outside Jaipur. This is Bagru block printing. This is Kuntil trying his hand at creating a fabric. So this is a beautiful experience we have where you can actually create your own fabric and take back with you as a souvenir. So it's a hands-on experience and it's great fun where you create your own fabric. Next. This is Bandhani. So Bandhani is basically the art of tie and dye. So where you basically tie small little things into a fabric and then color dye it in different forms. Again, this is hundreds of years old, and there are lovely Muslim families that work towards it. Here I'd like to ask a question actually from Jonty. Jonty, we've seen that a lot of the artisans and weavers' colonies and settlements are often outside the main tourist centers and plagued with poor infrastructure. How can these be made better connected or feasible for tourist visits? Like for instance, Bagru is outside Jaipur and we have to go all the way to Bagru. Like same with Hyderabad, you have to actually step out. So how do you weave it in?
So I think firstly, there is a target customer for this. It's not the regular tourists who would like to see it. People who are more interested in textiles would think that traveling like a couple of hours or 3 hours away from the city is actually not a big problem. So the person has to be a little more committed than just a person who wants to see just the main sites. Secondly, a lot of the governments are trying to do things where the cooperative society themselves have a little setup in these villages where they're showcasing the craft from start to finish, because it's not always possible to see the whole process in different houses, because on one particular day everybody might be doing dyeing, or everybody might be doing weaving. And these cooperative societies, we have seen in certain cases they have set up, some basic hygiene, loos, toilets, etc., so that the guests can use it. We do see that with the increasing urbanization of, say, a place like Hyderabad, the city is also spreading further and further away. So sometimes, while the actual distance from one end of the city to the village might be about 2.5 hours, because the city is so widespread, the outskirts of the city can actually be like a stopping point for lunch or something like that. When it comes sorry, go ahead.
No, say, finish.
Yeah, so it's sometimes possible to weave it in logistically without the guest facing too much of problems of using a clean loo or stopping at a place for lunch, which can be a hygienic place. Now the problem comes when you're trying to do more smaller villages. If you go to Andhra Pradesh, for example, if you're trying to go to Pedana, if you're trying to go to Upada, and those places, infrastructure is definitely a problem, because even if you're trying to connect these villages, finding a small town, where you can get a decent hotel to do an overnight stay is not always possible. So I guess we still have some ways to go, but it's just, I feel that a lot of people who are interested in fabric also tend to be a little more intrepid in travels. They don't mind kind of slumming it. They don't expect luxury accommodation in all the places. So it does seem that there is a market for it, and people, if I always feel that if the guests are told in advance that, look, XYZ towns or villages, we may not have the best of accommodation, if you're prepared for it, then it actually works out. So setting the right expectations and doing whatever possible to improve the infrastructure, I think that combination has to continue for people who do tours like us.
Right.
Can I just add just one thing to that?
Yeah.
Can I do that, Lovely? Okay. So
yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Once when I was taking these tourists, to various places, I was saying that you showcase everything so beautifully, like Stonehenge in the UK. I mean, just stones, but look at the way you publicize it. Look at the way you show it off. But we people don't. And you know what? The answer came. They said that that's what is beautiful about India.
Yeah.
We don't want everything showcased. We don't want fancy museums, air-conditioned museums where you just go and see. Yes, they are institutes of learning, but we do like the way, the informality. And I feel that rather than go into cooperatives, to go to places like Pochampally, it's a blaze of color, and to go from place to place. And as Jonty said, that if they are forewarned and if they know that they will not have that kind of comfort, they might have to ride over bumpy roads. That's what they like. They like to see the producer of these textiles in their natural environment. So that gave me a totally new insight. And instead of being apologetic, I used to show off our villages and weaving.
Yeah, that's reassuring to know, actually. It's reassuring. Yeah, people do like and appreciate authentic tours and authenticity more than anything else. It's just that sometimes the distance is so much that it becomes an expedition. So in such scenarios, I think Jonty's point about making a nice picnic spot to have lunch and making a day out of it, an interesting day out of the excursion would be an answer. Yes. So let's see. We have this beautiful tour in Jodhpur called the Bandhni Art of Jodhpur, where you meet some of the textile artists and see how it is done. Kuntil?
Yeah.
Are you frozen?
Yeah, I just get frozen when it kind of, the slides stay on for a longer time,
Keep your finger on the cursor.
Yeah, that's what I have to do. Just allow me a moment. Sorry.
I think we had a comment from one of the participants saying that people who do tours like it like to see India in its raw form, which basically that what you
so authenticity is important. Yeah. Very, very important. So then we have this beautiful tour in Udaipur. Udaipur also has some huge range of tie and dye and leheriya, which is the striped dyeing arts and also they have a beautiful craft called koftkari, which is an intricate craft of engraving on the swords, on ceremonial swords and daggers. And it still goes on because the Rajputs in Rajasthan and also the Sikhs during their weddings carry these long swords, as they're called kirpans, and all of them have engravings, and that's called koftkari, and that's what you get to see in Udaipur when you meet some of these rare textile artists. Not just the tie and dye and the leheriyas. There's an artist we have here who does the Bhopal Shahi Leheriya, which is like multicolored, huge, and he has some amazing stories of how the royal family gave them patronage and wanted a typical type of Leheriya for their family. So that's something interesting to do in Udaipur with us. Going forward, Util. So we come to Gujarat now. So we've covered kind of a little bit of the north, and now we come to Gujarat, the western part. Gujarat is very rich in their textile tradition, and Bandhani, of course, is very similar to the Bandhani you have in Rajasthan. Other than Bandhani, you also have some other styles of textiles called shisha, mashru. Shisha is basically the mirror work, and mashru, and all the tribals in the villages who create the Rabadi, Ahir, Meghwal, they are the tribals who create beautiful crafts, hand embroidered things. And then you have weaves like patola in specialized towns. So we'll talk about that in the next slide, I think. Patola, yes. So Patola, I have a beautiful story on Patola. It's supposed to be one of the most expensive saris in India. And the wrapping and dyeing process for just one color takes a week. And doing all the color takes 1 or 2 months. Apparently, designing and making one sari takes at least 7 months from start to finish. Such was the allure of Patola that it started a royal feud between King Kumar Pala and the King of Jalna. So furious with receiving second-hand Patola yards that he used to wear to the temple, so the King of Gujarat bought 700 Patola artisans and their families to Patan from Maharashtra and Karnataka and began the production of the untainted patola in a town called Patan. So this is the beautiful trivia about the patola artisans getting royal patronage and how the dyeing is so important in that specialized weave. I asked Sabita here. Sabita, tell us something about natural dyes, first of all, and the efforts to revive old traditions now. And also, if you know a little bit more about patola, I'm sure our viewers would like to hear your.
Patola is not affordable by us in the sense it's so expensive.
Yes.
And something like, you can pay 12, 15 lakhs for one sari. And
wow.
How many of us would like to wrap around a sari so expensive around us? And patola is very, very difficult because it's the double ikat. The single ikats are easier, though I wouldn't say it's an easy process because the whole design is sort of graphed and put on the warp. And just imagine how scientifically it's done, where it's in perfect alignment. And those little jagged, things that you see are because, you cannot be so precise as to have it in exactly the straight lines, but that somehow adds to the beauty. So a double patola, which requires integration of both the warp and the weft, that makes it really very expensive. And what was your next question? You asked me something.
So natural dyes. Tell us something about natural dyes.
Okay, see, in the old days, we didn't have anything else to use but natural dyes. People made dyes out of barks of trees, of flowers. We had manjishta. We used iron filings to have black color. Then we dried pomegranate and made it into orange color and so on. Well, this was what was used even in silk sarees. And then, very suddenly, the chemical dyes stormed the bastion of weaving. And even in Kalakshetra, this is what happened. From natural dyes, there was a complete switch over to chemical dyes because the kind of color variations was dizzying. You could have any color. You could reproduce colors which the natural dye gave to perfection. And you could have them muted, you can have them bright. And India just went all out to absorb the chemical dyes because in South India especially, women like to dress in bright colors irrespective of age. Whereas in the north, in Delhi, you find people wearing muted colors. But it was not like that. You went to any wedding, it was so beautiful to see everybody like that. So the natural dyes have come back now because people realize that chemicals are bad and then it's bad for the atmosphere. So we do a lot of revival work. There's a lot of revival work going on in Dindigul where they study natural dyes and bring it to the fore. But it is difficult to, initially when I joined as senior consultant in Kalakshetra, I found that the only colors that they were bringing in were maroon and black all the time. Then we got a printer who was working, a national awardee who was working with the Weaver Service Center. He had retired, and I somehow just dragged him in there here to Kalakshetra, and we managed to produce a palette of colors. We could produce mauve, we could produce light orange, and we could produce from the bark of a certain tree, we could produce a pink, which was one of my favorites. So we had so much of color. And in natural dye, the advantage is that you can never go wrong in the combination. You can add anything to anything and you will get that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but I must tell you that the whole process is very intricate. Getting the dye stuff, it's messy and it's expensive. So even in silk sarees, while I've been trying to tell people to use natural dyes, they are running away from it because it's difficult,
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for your insight, Savita. Kuntil? So when we talk about Gujarat, we have to talk about the Calico Museum in Ahmedabad. This is one of the iconic textile museums in India, and it was set up in 1949 by the famous industrialist Gautam Sarabhai and his sister Geeta Sarabhai, and it has some beautiful textiles spanning generations and years, and they've kept it really well, and they limit the number of people which can visit at a given point of time, so that the restricted numbers actually ensure that it's not overexposed and things don't get damaged. So Jonty, do you think there are more museums of this scale in India, or even to a lesser scale?
There are certain sections in certain museums which have a textile kind of a
corner. Yeah.
I can't say with certainty that this scale is available in any other place. Only we do have some people in Hyderabad, for example, and who collect fabrics, but they're private collections, so we do sometimes get the opportunity to get these people to fabric collection, but it's not a public kind of a exhibition.
I think yeah, I think you're right. There are many private collectors with some beautiful heirlooms that they have kind of inherited from generations. Savita is one. I'm sure her cupboard's full of stuff.
Okay. I never throw away sarees. I think no museum can match the magnificence of this Calico Museum. But there is the Delhi Crafts Museum.
Yes.
That has some beautiful things. And in the south, I'm sorry to say, though we've got such a plethora of fabrics that we can showcase. Our museum is more, they emphasize on the bronzes, and one of the 3 Kodali Karpurs are there. And I took a group once to show that, but they are not preserved and kept it in the way I would recommend. Lakshmi Chitra in Chennai, I worked at, starting that museum as well. And they've got a collection of, textile pieces where people donate their saris and scraps of fabric, for this, and they're all labeled. And the person who runs Debbie is she's got a degree in archaeology, and she's also gone and studied museums in various places. So I hope that in time that will also equal the Sarabhai Museum.
Right. I have seen some beautiful Kantha work in the museums in Kolkata, actually. And Kolkata has some amazing museums and smaller, lesser known museums, and they have kind of preserved, but not in the way you would want them to, but still nicely done. There's some amazing Kantha work preserved in Kolkata Museum. And as you said, as Jonty said also, and you said, bits and pieces, all our museums have one little section on textiles where you find some stunning work which you wish was better preserved. So thank you there. And then this visit to Patan to see actually the weaving of Patola sari is very much possible. And another important weave in this area is mushroom. It's a combination of silk and cotton. Happens to be Jonty's favorite, as she said, favorite weave. And this is something you can see in Patan, and it can be very well woven into an itinerary. And we also have a Gujarat itinerary on the next slide, where we do a textile tour just of Gujarat, visiting some of these rare places where these textiles happen. Kuntal, can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is the textile itinerary. So you start with Bhuj, which is known as the hub of textiles in Gujarat. And you see artisans weaving thick shawls and blankets and on pit looms. And then you also go to Ajrakpur, where Ajrak is also a kind of textile, and you meet some people that we know who make beautiful prints and stuff. Then there is the Sada, then there's Patan, obviously Ahmedabad. You end in Ahmedabad, and you can add Rajasthan to this itinerary by flying to Jaipur and adding a new dimension to the textile richness of Rajasthan to it. So this whole itinerary can be done as well. Can we go to the next slide now? Okay, let's come to Bengal. I spoke about the museums in Bengal with Kantha work, which is the hand embroidery. It's a beautiful form of upscaling and reusing an old fabric. So women would make it for their children because the fabric was soft, they would stitch together a whole lot of fabric, and it was very comforting for the kids to use that Kantha fabric, which is later on became a huge art. Here we are talking about Jamdani now. Jamdani is this beautiful, very delicate weave that happens. So basically, there is a dark colored thread and a light colored thread. So it's a shadow and light and shade is how it comes. And so half the sari is light and the motifs are darker in fabric and in feel. So it's a multi-textured sari. That's how Jamdanis are, and they are very delicate. Originally in Dhakai, as they say, they were made in East Bengal, formerly East Bengal, in Dhaka, and obviously the art has come to this part as well, and they make it. Jamdani literally means a flower vase, and so it has flower motifs all over the saris. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is, as I said, these are finest creations of Indian handlooms. We also have a textile program in Bengal, which is outside of Kolkata. It's in our Explore brochure. It's available. There's a textile tour that takes you to these small hamlets outside of Kolkata. All right, so Bengal muslin is hugely famous, and 14th century Sufi poet Amir Khusro has remarked that 100 yards of it can pass through the eye of a needle. So fine is its texture, and yet the point of the steel can't pierce through it easily. It is so transparent in light that it looks as if one is no dress at all, but has only smeared the body with pure water. It is so transparent and translucent and so delicate. Indian muslin found its way to the distant corners of the world, and this is evident from the writings of Jawaharlal Nehru, who reminiscences 4,000 years old mummies of Egypt were wrapped in fine Indian muslin. And the Ottoman Empire, as I said, had already spoken about the draining of wealth to India because of the expensive muslin that people were buying from it. It was that famous. Then, as I said, we have a beautiful textile itinerary in and around Kolkata. We also do a 2-day textile workshop in the city of Kolkata in a weaver's studio, which is well known for its contemporary styles and wearable textiles made of hand block printing and traditional handloom and embroidery techniques such as kantha, as I said. So we have a beautiful 2 days workshop there. And you can take back some of the souvenirs that are created here. Next. Then comes the Muga silk in Assam. And this is the silk that is created is golden in color. And it's very, very unique. And the women wear the mekla chadar on their weddings. And it's very, very formal what they wear. And it's iconic of Assam, the red colored weave on the golden silk sari. Then also another fabric which is famous from Assam is the fabric of non-violence, the Endi silk or airy silk as it's called. It's on the next slide, Kuntil, and you'd be proud I'm talking about your Assam. Kuntil is based out of Jorhat, and he's helping me with this slide presentation. And this is one of his favorite topics. So there is a beautiful excursion we do to Swalkuchi, which is about an hour's drive from Guwahati to see the weavers in this beautiful village who are not just doing the Moga silk weaving, but also the non-violent silk. And why is it non-violent? Because the silkworm is not stifled or killed during the process of taking silk out of the cocoon. And that's why it's called the non-violent silk. And a lot of monks and Buddhists prefer this kind of silk. Then from Assam, we come to the Gangetic Plains of Uttar Pradesh, which is kind of the hub of arts and crafts. So Lucknow, Lucknow is the capital of Uttar Pradesh, and Lucknow is famous for its chicken curry. Chicken curry is actually an embroidery. The embroidery is such that it has, it looks like somebody painted stuff on the fabric, and because it has shade, it has a shaded bottom. So it's beautiful from the top and the back. Noor Jahan, who's the wife of Emperor Jahangir, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, is supposed to have introduced this form of embroidery, this art form of embroidery. It used to be really white on white, but now people use multiple colors to create different interests. Next slide. We talk about Lucknow, we have to also talk about Zardozi, which is another beautiful form of embroidery. And it's its center is supposed to have been Lucknow, but now you have Zardozi all over India. I've seen Zardozi in Hyderabad with Jaunty in one of the bylanes of going to the old market. There are also some beautiful work being done in Delhi, in the heart of Delhi, and all over India. Zardozi work is done. Actually, it's a very popular form of um, golden embroidery on fabric, and it's done on a huge frame, and people sit on the floor and do it, or one or two people can do it simultaneously, and it's beautiful to watch craftsmen do this. And there's some fantastic history around it. We have this tour in Lucknow where you can actually go and see this NGO run by Madhvi Kukreja, where you see the Zardozi work and the chicken curry work and get to meet the craftsmen. There is an interesting story around Zardozi, which is on the next slide. Kunter? Yes, so this is the famous peacock gown of Lady Mary Curzon. So when the British came to India, they were so swayed by the opulent weaves of the country that they began to incorporate these into their gowns and attires. One of the most luxurious creations that made it to the fashion houses was this gown worn by Lady Mary Curzon, Lady Curzon. So as you can see, this is Zardozi work. Replicating the tail of a peacock. It's absolutely gorgeous and stunning. So here I want to ask, okay, let's come to Banaras first. Let's talk about Banaras. So not far from Lucknow is Banaras, which is the capital of silk weaving in India. Hugely popular Banarsi. No woman's trousseau is complete without a Banarsi silk sari. And Banarsi silk is also, you have different types of silks that they use, but katan, most popular silk they use. These days they use other fabrics also, with georgettes and chiffons and even some other handloom varieties of silk they use. But the weaving is what is very, very important. And there's a huge revival of Banarasi silk weaves happening in India. There was the government is kind of supporting them, and it happens to be the Prime Minister's constituency, and they are kind of relocating the weavers to New Colony, which is just a little outside the hub of the city, so that they get their own space and they are able to they have more space basically. And that relocation, I think, is halfway through. I don't know what's happening now with it, but again, Banarsi silks are beautiful. Now, I was talking about the Naqshbands when I spoke about the Pashmina shawls in Kashmir. The similar concept is followed here. You know, at the heart of the opulent Banarsi sari is its naqsha, the pattern, and more importantly, the Naqshband, which is the designer. The Naqshbands were far more than mere designers. They were actually skilled artisans, fluent in the vocabulary of motifs and renderings of different styles. He was also aware of the weaver's body and how the designs were to fall exactly at the right place. Earliest Banarsi saris featured a lot of motifs of Persian origin, such as hunting scenes, pomegranates, tree of life, and even poems. But the recent ones I have seen actually have the whole ghats. There's a beautiful sari which has the ghats of Banaras on its border, and it's quite stunning to see. So that's your Banarsi weave, a must-have in a woman's trousseau, an Indian bride's trousseau. So we have this tour going to the Weavers District in Banaras. Here I want to ask Jaunty a question about shopping. So how can we actually incorporate textile experiences into sightseeing tours, Jaunty, without making it a shopping activity? Because nobody likes forced shopping. And how can we actually do it delicately, that is a real authentic experience and not one shopping expedition?
we also struggled with it, especially in the beginning when we were designing these tours.
Yeah.
And the thing we realized is that, a lot of the villages that we take people to, like Pochampalli, Koilgudam, Puttapaka, and which are in the outskirts, don't really have a setup for selling. Only if you walk into the cooperatives or something like that, run by the, a set of weavers, would you be in a position to buy. But if you go to the actual homes, you're actually able to see the dyeing process, you're able to see the process of weaving without having the pressure of buying anything. The same may not be true for every place, because a lot of people, the moment you tell them, would you like to see weaving, immediately the guest says, oh, we are not interested in buying anything. And then we also always have to tell them that no, it's not about buying at all.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we do get guests who, after seeing a fabric, they always say that I wish I could have bought it. I wish I could have bought the sample. So, in cases where we have gone to the villages, because these people end up selling to either third party or to export houses, etc., we're not always in a position to get them to buy it. So maybe in those times we stop at the cooperative shop to pick it up. But again, going back to what I said about experiences like this, telling the guests very clearly, in case there is, for example, the workshop that we used to take people to within the city where the Himru Mashru Paitani work is done, which currently is not really operational. There is a store attached to that, to the workshop. So even before we enter the experience, if we tell the guests that, look, we're going to the workshop, there is a store next door, if you want to, then we will enter it, otherwise we will not. To again set expectations that we don't have to enter the store. And because I was very clear while setting up this thing that we don't want to have any kind of commercial links with these people. So we actually, when we go to the villages, we pay the weaver for the time that he's spending with us and the guests. So it's actually reverse. We actually pay the artisans, rather than say that, oh, if you sell to so and so customer, we need a cut, which is kind of par for the course in the sector. So we have done things like this. Again, it doesn't always work. The guests do feel uncomfortable the moment you say that, but that's how we deal with it.
Yeah, interesting. We are always in this dichotomy, in this situation where do you draw the line, and how do you kind of not make it a commercial activity? So a good point about compensating and paying something to the weavers who you're visiting, rather than telling them that, oh, there might be a purchase. Yeah, exactly. So thank you for that. Then when you're talking about Uttar Pradesh, we cannot talk about the rugs and carpets that are made in Mirzapur. Those are also a special kind of weaves and a huge industry. They provide beautiful handmade carpets and rugs and daris all over India. And this kind of industry was set up here in the 1920s. And was taken over by Oakley Bowden and Taylor, the founders, or OBT. So again, it was brought on the world map. The quality and the level of stuff that they do there is brilliant. Next, so now we come to Jaunty's backyard, Telangana Ikat. So this is her thing, and so Telangana was part of Hyderabad. Just to give people who don't know an idea, that Andhra Pradesh. I'm sorry, Andhra Pradesh, and so the states were split into two: Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and so the craft traditions and art obviously remains very similar in both the states, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. And Pochampalli is one of the iconic traditions of the state. So Jaunty, tell us something about this now, the Pochampalli Ikat.
So Pochampalli was a part of the Bhudan movement, where right after independence, people were large landlords, and people who had huge amounts of land were encouraged to donate land to the government and to the people, actually. And the government then took one particular set of villages and invited artisans from across to come and settle down there and practice the ikat weaving. So as a village, it's a fairly recent village, and when I say recent, I mean the 50s. But as a tradition, the ikat tradition goes back much longer. And there are cluster of villages: Pochampalli, Koilgudam, Puttapaka. Those are the three main villages. Pochampalli deals mostly with silks. Puttapaka also silk, but the weaving is slightly different. But yeah, more or less ikat. And Koilgudam is known for its cotton fabric ikat. And ikat is a process where actually each of the threads are actually dyed, and then they're put together in a particular contraption so the pattern emerges before the thread is then put onto the either the loom or on the spool. And then when you weave it, the patterns actually coincide in such a way that the fabric, the design emerges. So unlike say bandhani, where the design, or printing where the design is put after the fabric is woven, here the design is woven into the fabric. So on both sides of the fabric, you can actually see the pattern. And it's a little difficult concept to understand when you see the fabric, but what our aim is to show people exactly how the whole process takes place. So in fact, we go to a couple of houses, and one of them specializes in natural colors. Start from the basic process where we get him to show us how he extracts the natural colors. And he extracts dyes, like Sabita was saying, from iron pieces, from certain flowers, from pomegranate skin, seeds, etc. And then he shows the whole process of how bunches of threads tied with rubber, and then do the of coloring it 2 times, 3 times, so that you have the pattern that emerges. And then on a very small scale, we show them how the fabric is woven, and then we take people to the larger homes where they see the large looms where they're doing either the bedspreads or the saris or what have you, and then they actually are able to connect how the whole process happens on a large scale. That's basically our our fabric tour. So since the village is about 60-65 kilometers away, it ends up being an almost a full day kind of a trek.
Right. So my next question to you was going to be about your tell us about your tour, which kind of you've covered a little bit about the textile detour that you do in and around Hyderabad, covering some of these areas. So is there something you'd like to add to what you've said?
See, though, apart from ikat, we also do simple block printing. There are a couple of workshops which do block printing, some who do screen printing, some of them who do embroidery in the local market which you were mentioning. So if the person is really into fabrics, we can make it like a full day experience with the villages as well as in the city. Apart from that, we have a kind of a unit in the outskirts of the city, about 30 kilometers away from the city, where if you are interested, and if we have a group of say about 6 people or above, we can do a fabric experience where they come and actually see the whole process of natural dyes, and they get to see the block printing, they get to do the block printing. It's almost like a 2-day workshop, and like you said in some of the other tours, they get to keep what they have made.
Okay, so I have a technical question now on ikat. Between the both of you, I guess you can answer. So the question is that there is ikat in a whole lot of places. Odisha has ikat, Gujarat has ikat, and Telangana has ikat. Is it similar, all the ikat that we see around, or are there differences in style and technique?
Savita, do you want to take that? I'll add to it later in case I feel I have anything to add.
There are differences in style, totally, because they are dictated by what they are inspired by. Like in Orissa, they've been, inspired by the Sun Temple, and you would see the wheels in almost all their, creations. And the technique is varied again, as I said, some are single ikat, some are double ikat. The double ikats are more expensive. Perhaps Jonty could elaborate more on this.
Okay, so double ikat is where, okay, let me explain single ikat first. So in single ikat, usually, for those who are familiar with fabric, the warp and the weft, which is the horizontal and the vertical parts of the fabric, is what makes the threads kind of go one into the other and create the fabric that we know. So in single ikat, usually the warp is plain, and then the weft has the pattern. So it's a little easier to weave because you're not actually coordinating with anything on the warp. Whereas in double ikat, what happens is that the warp has the design and the weft has a design. So just to give you a simple explanation, if you want to make a square, it's difficult to do it in single ikat because you need both the warp and the weft to have the pattern for it to become a square. Whereas the V shape, which is usually what you see in a traditional ikat, the simple single ikat, you can just have the pattern on the weft and or the pattern only on the warp and keep the weft plain. There are both ways of doing it. Whereas in the double ikat, it takes more time because each time you're doing the weft, which is each time the shuttle is moving through the threads of the warp to create the weft, you have to make sure that it's coordinated with what is already there on the weft, because only when the two are aligned with each other do you get the motif the way you want it. Again, double ikat techniques exist in places like Patola. Patola is double ikat. Even you find double ikat in places like Pochampally as well. The difference between Patola and say a double ikat in Pochampally would be the intricacy of it. Whereas in Patola, they are a little obsessed with getting, you get this haziness of, around, say, for example, if it's a horse or a flower or, a lotus petal or something like that, you sometimes have a little bit of a haziness because of the warp and the weft on the edges being a little, misaligned, so to speak. Whereas in Patola, it's a lot more aligned. So you have a very, very faint hazing around the patterns and the motifs, which is why it takes a much, much longer process, longer time to finish a Patola sari versus a double ikat or a single ikat sari in other places. Savita, please add, and especially if I'm saying something wrong, please go ahead because you're definitely the.
There isn't any. You've explained it all beautifully. As she said, that is why the Patola saris are so expensive because they've got this, they've got an eye on detail, and it has to be so perfectly aligned that it naturally takes more labor, it takes more time. And I always find Pochampally is good for furnishing fabrics and for dress material and so on. But Pochampally saris, I would prefer a Patola. And this Telia Rumal is something which I was fascinated. In the 80s, when I visited, the places, Koilgudam and those places where they were producing it, I found that, it was there that I learned that the whole yarn is dipped in oil. That is why it's called Telia Rumal. And then only, and it is done only with vegetable dyes. And it is so beautiful. I was asking them, why don't they replicate this on saris? They said, yes, Kopul Jaikar and Markan Singh have already come and they're going to have this Festival of India in Britain where they are going to reproduce saris. So we started taking a lot of saris from there. And at that time, this Murli Sari House, and they were very, very simple people. They were weavers who just sat and talked to us. Now he's grown big. He's got so many awards and exporting things. Yes, so that's it.
Yeah, and Telia usually, from what I've done research, it used to be worn by women while they were working in the fields, like as almost like an apron, so that the sari would not get dirty.
So
and the and the turban as well by people who deliver milk. So those were almost you could say symbols of certain castes, and which over a period of time, thankfully, have become less rigid.
Very friendly with the milkmen. to persuade to give off their turbans.
Yeah, correct.
So beautiful, yes.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so moving on, we come to Mysore silk. Mysore silk, there's a huge industry around it. It's a very typical kind of silk, and they have in Mysore city, there's a huge sericulture department that kind of works towards it. There's just simply plain silk with a gold border, and there's nothing intricate about it. So the Maharaja of Mysore is supposed to have, the rulers of Mysore is supposed to have brought 32 looms from Europe and established like one factory which they wanted a certain style, type of silk, and that's why this whole thing came about. And it's very, very much possible to go and see these looms in the factory that is there in Mysore city. We have a tour that takes you around to see the silk sericulture, how cocoons are kept. There's a whole research center, and you also get to see the weaving that happens in the looms there. They have machine looms, and they also have hand looms in the factory that is there. And it's run by the Karnataka state government. Then coming to Kanjivaram silk and Tamil Nadu. So here, Sabita, I would invite you to talk a little bit about the Tamil Nadu tradition, textile traditions, and over
Okay.
to you.
Yeah. Now we've got a different tradition in the sense that Kanjivaram silk sari owes its speciality to the Korwe technique. The Korwe technique, as see, you all know that this is the warp and this is the weft, and when they both meld, that then it makes up the main body of the sari. But in a Korwe sari, what happens is the border is solid; it's a contrast, so it's woven separately on the loom. The body of the sari is woven separately on the loom. The pallu is woven separately, and both are interlocked on the loom to produce a Korwe sari. And it's a very, very complicated process. And it requires 3 weavers and hours of sitting on the loom and doing it, which is why it is almost languished, in the sense no one wanted to weave a Korwe sari because they felt that it was too much work and the wages they received were very low. And I set about going to various weavers wherever I met them, asking them whether they could weave a Korwe sari. They said, why should we when we can make one, which looks like a Korwe sari? And so what's so great? And people can't discriminate. They don't know any better. Then till I found there was this weaver from Tanjavur who was an 8th generation weaver. And I put the same question to him. I said, can you weave a Korwe sari? And because he was young, I told him what a Korwe sari is all about. I gave him a sample. And he said, Panna mudiyum, which means I will do it. So in about 10 days time, he produced a sample, and I was so surprised because I had taken a bet with a local shop there. He said that in your lifetime, in your grandchildren's lifetime, you're not going to see a Korwe sari woven again. And this man took it as a commitment. He was all of 24, 25, and he came. He was very simply dressed. They always wear veshtis and shirts. I mentored him, gave him designs, sat with him with colors and various things, and showed him what the market wanted. How to create for the market, keeping within tradition. And my God, he has evolved so much. And I said, you can't survive without being computer science. And ultimately, you've got to have your own line. You've got to have, you should be able to sell online. Today, he wears tucked-in shirts, he wears jeans, and he's learnt English, and he does sell online. They weave the Kanjivaram sari tradition in Tanjavur, but it's more expensive because Tanjavur's the labor is high. And when you were talking about marketing, see, what happened is, like some of the tourism people I lecture to, I've also pointed them to Tanjavur because they've got a full setup there, and when I mentor or when I work with weavers, it's not a single weaver, but a community of weavers. So this gentleman, his name is Vijay Ganesh, he has in his own way trained communities of weavers. And it's a joy to go there, and he explains everything to them. And he has saris stocked at home. So if they say, where do you think I can buy one? He just shows it to them. And it's a very effective way, and you're not pushing sales. I have told him never to push sales. When tourists come, you respect them, give them the knowledge, but do not push sales. And Kanjivaram silk, many people ask, how do you recognize the Kanjivaram silk? The Kanjivaram silk should not weigh less than 560 grams. It can go up to 1000 grams, which is why most women don't wear them these days. And they would never use half fine zari. The zari is pure. And if you melted the sari, you'll get a block of silver, because that's how the sari is made. It's a red thread wound in pure silver and dipped in 24 karat molten gold. That's how you get the. So now Tamil Nadu government is also opening stores in India, I mean in near about Chennai, where you can get it. But most of the sari comes from Surat. So the Kanchipuram sari is not easily, replaceable, or you cannot really hope to get Kanchipuram sari anywhere else. So it is a must in every woman's wardrobe.
Thank you, Sabita. We will also look at Kalakshetra. Actually, Sabita introduced me to Kalakshetra. We went there together. And there's some very interesting work going on in Kalakshetra with weaves and with, especially with Kalamkari. Savita, would you like to tell us a little bit about your Kodali Karupur sari there, and also the work going on in Kalakshetra with the revival of certain techniques, especially Kalamkari?
Okay, yeah. See, I'm also known as a textile revivalist, because I feel that all our traditions should not be lost in the annals of time, because it has been mainly an oral tradition passed on from father to son, and we don't have anything documented. So, and these days the younger people are moving away from the tradition. They don't no longer want to continue there. Rukmani Devi, the doyen of Bharatanatyam, she was the one who introduced the Kalakshetra Foundation to start the looms, because they were making dance sarees. Initially, they started with vegetable dye, and since she was on the Animal Welfare Board, fond of animals, she introduced the Ahimsa silk, which means the cocoons are not, I mean, the silkworms are not allowed to die when they boil them, but they wait for them to fly out. So the silk is not as fine as it is when you use the cocoons with the silkworms in them. But the silk is beautiful and they cost a bomb. So again, there's a very limited market for it. Now in Kalakshetra, I joined as a senior consultant, which mostly an honorarium, and I used to procure materials and get it for them. And I did much the same work as I was doing when I had my boutique. That is, I had a hand block printing unit for 15 years. They have a hand block printing unit. They have a weaving unit, and I had about 30 captive looms all over India. And there was dyeing, there was printing, there was weaving. So it was all really beautiful. And I thought that why not do a revival here? And then my heart was always with the Kodali Karpur sari. And this was for the Tanjavur royalty. And it is a very, very, very special fabric. So what I did was to cut through the red tape. It took me about 2 years to get the sanction. And then Weaver Service Center, which had replicated the sari some time ago, I went to them, got their advice. Then we went to the museum and saw the actual sari and tried to use the same kind of warp and weft that they had used. And so I wish there's no time to explain the process, but it looks like an ordinary printed sari, but it isn't, because we do the Jamdani technique to weave the gold motifs, and then the printing is done around the gold. As you can see here in this slide, you see all those teardrop things, they're all in gold. And it should be, the blocks should be made so well. And if they don't fit, they are broken and a new set of blocks, are done. But what I did was I overcame this thing, because we had a marvelous artist from Kalahasti who was incidentally working with me when I had the boutique. So I got him and his team to paint the whole sari so that there could be no mistakes. There wouldn't be any overprinting. And that sari, we reproduced one sari, and that was priced at 1.5 lakhs, and already about 7 or 8 people had signed up to buy it. But for some reason, Kalakshetra was not reproducing it. So I can't really call it a revival. But what I did was, I got them to use the same blocks and print on fabrics, gossamer fabrics like the Maheshwaris and the Chanderis. And they were exquisite. They were selling for 3,000 and 4,000. And I think we've sold about 600 saris till date using the same colors, the same blocks, which means affordability also is there, but there were people who were willing to buy it and keep it in their wardrobe. So that is there in their museum in Kalakshetra.
Thank you, Sabita, for that insight into all your efforts in reviving kalamkari with different fabrics. Then we have also the Kanchipuram Silk Weaving Center in Kanchipuram, and it's not very far from Chennai, which can be visited. And a lot of the tours actually include Kanchipuram and see some of the weaving that happens there. So this is the traditional Kanchipuram sari that Sabita earlier spoke about that you get to see in this place. Then I want to just wrap up now. Basically, we are also running out of time. So Crafts Council of India actually was established to kind of create a cooperative and collectively help all these artisans sell their product properly, and also a whole lot of design intervention that happened with designers trying to help these people be accessible to the buyers, to the the art houses and the big fashion houses who would accept their art. So they have a beautiful mission, and there also I think Sabita has done tremendous work with her artisans and revival of artisans. I'll come to you, Sabita, in the next slide now. So some of the initiatives that the government has taken and private enterprises have taken, a whole lot of NGOs. So there is the Delhi Haat that was established by Jaya Jaitley. Then there's the Crafts Museum in Delhi. Then there's also the Dastkar that Laila Tayyabji set up in Delhi. So a whole lot of craft revival trusts and are there initiatives are there which can be visited by some of our guests who are coming. In Varanasi now, as I spoke about, the government has taken an initiative to facilitate the weavers of Varanasi. Here, Sabita, I'd like to ask you to talk about your efforts to sustain the livelihoods of weavers during difficult times. What initiatives have you and your NGO taken to do this?
See, actually, the NGO that I'm a part of, Crafts Council, they focus mostly on crafts and yes, also textiles. And they used to draw me in whenever they needed anything to do with textiles. But what is happening now is just when we were reaching the point when we could give them a sustainable livelihood, we were just scratching the surface and getting there. And then this COVID-19 happened. And then you see now what has happened is I'm trying to raise funds for them, because when I talk to a whole cross-section of them from all over India, their plaint is, yes, they don't have food, enough food, but even that they say they can sustain. But they want money to buy yarn. They don't have money to buy yarn, and they don't have raw material procurement. And I said, why do you want to buy yarn? What are you going to do? We are going to weave. We're going to make
sari. Right. So
yeah. So Cooptex and government agencies will undertake to buy these things. But I hope to raise funds and through the NGOs give it to them. So I didn't want to take too long because I know we are running out of time.
Yeah. Thank you for that. No, I wanted you to tell everybody about the project that you're working on.
Yeah.
Now, role of fashion is also very, very important. Whole lot of new age textiles are coming. Sabita was telling me earlier, people are using banana fiber, and of course, jute has been there.
Banana fiber, pineapple fiber, jute.
Yeah.
Weaving all this, and a whole lot of them in Anakaputtur need help. So anybody wanting to donate or has an interest, I want to do this program with you in your next session.
Right. Thank you. So then, as I said, the role of fashion is very important in bringing the traditional crafts to the fore. And that's what some of our famous designers have done, who've used khadi as their preferred fabric and who use traditional crafts. Some of the names that are Ritu Kumar, Sabyasachi, Abu Jani, Sandeep Khosla, among a whole lot of other artists who are there.
Be fabrics from Goa. Did you know Goa had a tradition of saris? Unfortunately,
right.
Fabrics, yes.
Yeah. Next slide, Kuntal. Yeah, so these are some of the bringing traditional textile homes. These are some of the famous brands where people actually like to shop. And they've actually brought the khadi and Indian handloom industry to the fore. I have to say, Fab India did a tremendous job of bringing the traditional Indian fabric to the fore. And Anokhi in Jaipur, I mean, their block printing workshop, the museum is actually really beautiful to see. Some of our tours go there to see that. If people want to shop, these are the places to go shop, looking for traditional fabrics and textiles of India. Kuntal? Next. We are freezing. So some of the initiatives we as a company have taken in promoting textiles, and that we work with Literacy India, which is a non-profit organization, and it kind of encourages and empowers women, and all the bags, jute bags and paper bags that are made are recycled from stuff, and we use that for our clients. And also visit to Kaushala Kala Kendra in Sandur, near in Karnataka, and Sitwara, Sadhna. These are some of the NGOs that we support in India, where you can actually go and see women working and can be included as part of the tour. Next. So I'm going to end this presentation with two questions. One question actually to both our panelists. How can tourism help in the revival of artisans and traditional crafts of India? I guess if we bring tourists in, it lends a whole lot of attention to them. So Jonty, would you like to tell us what you think about this?
Yeah, I think to me, from my experience, I can't talk numbers, as to how much it has impacted. But what happens is when people from either outside India or outside a particular city where the craft is being showcased, people tend to, take pride in what they're doing. And that seems to have gone down a little bit, given all the other things. Because if you speak to the next generation of weavers, or say the sons and daughters of the weavers, nobody really is very keen to continue the tradition. And in fact, the weaver himself will say, what is the point in doing this? I may as well have him do computer engineering and go off, which is a popular thing part of the country, at least. So this whole thing of, pride of continuing a tradition, because for a lot of them, it just seems to be like a job that they do, a way to earn money because their forefathers have been doing it. And I think tourism may not bring about the big numbers that, say, a fashion industry or initiative like Fab India would bring, bringing about a sense of achievement, a sense of pride, and hopefully then, helping the next generation take on the work. I think that would be the bigger contribution of tourism to any of these kind of techniques.
Right. Thank you, Jonty. And Sabita, would you like to add something to what Jonty said? And then we'll end it.
I'm inclined to agree with her on most things. And they have to have pride in their weaving, which is not there. So I have been talking in their own language and addressing them and trying to tell them what they're doing is fabulous. And the only way we can keep it up is increase their wages. And even if we are offering it to a niche clientele, it doesn't matter. At least we will not lose the tradition. So that's the only way we can do it. And then it's a wrong time to say, women, please buy, because none of us feel like buying now. We open our wardrobes and say, what are we going to do with so much of stuff? But look upon it as a donation. Look upon it as something you can give away to somebody else. But unless you buy, the handloom weaver is not going to survive. And that has to be extended to the tourists also.
Right. Right. On that note, I think we'll end this session. Thank you so much, Jonty and Sabita, for participating in this exciting discussion on textiles. I know we've really stretched ourselves with time, and thank you so much for your time. We have some questions, but I don't think we have time to take them up. So I will address the questions separately. And thank you for your time, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a lovely experience and I enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you, lovely.
Thank you.